This is the Dover Download Podcast. My name is Christopher Parker, and for the past 25 years, I've had the pleasure of working with, learning from, and talking to a variety of volunteer, staff, and community members. This podcast explores conversations, activities, and a variety of policies and programs which exist here in Dover to improve the community in one way or another. Recently, we had a podcast conversation with Ryan Pope and George Regan from New Hampshire Housing Finance. Today, we have Ryan back, and he's joined by Sarah Reitzman, also of New Hampshire Housing Finance. We're going to talk about housing, obviously, but also the impact of student enrollment and school enrollment in general in the state, and maybe a little about Dover itself. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Chris. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you. Ryan, we're going to let Sarah go first because you've introduced yourself before, and longtime listeners, first-time callers, will remember you. But Sarah, what can you tell the listener about Sarah Reitzman and who you are and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Sarah Reitzman. I am the manager of community engagement education for New Hampshire Housing. Prior to that, I was the executive director of the Workforce Housing Coalition of the Greater Seacoast. So I've been sort of involved in this housing world in Dover for several years now. I actually grew up, I was just telling Ryan this before we started, I grew up in Nottingham. And so when I went to high school, I had the choice between Dover and Co-Brown. So it's kind of fun to be back talking about sort of school enrollment and what influences that. I also told Ryan, unfortunately, I chose Co-Brown. But my brother went to Dover, so we picked different high schools. I'm so sorry.
Your parents must have loved that.
They
I hope
did.
you weren't there at the same time.
We were not there at the same time.
So housing, it's a critical need. It's a critical component that we talk about a lot. Probably should talk about more, which is why we're having you here twice in the first quarter of 2025. What's going on with the relationship between housing and school enrollment? Does the data give us some direction as to what we need to be worried about or excited about?
Yeah, absolutely. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. So it's one of these sort of myths or misunderstandings about this relationship between housing development, school enrollment, and our property taxes that's kind of three parts. So the first part is that we greatly overestimate how many school kids are going to live in housing. We build 100 apartments, and there's not going to be 200 kids there. There's not 2 kids per unit. We're talking more like 0.16 kids-ish. The second part of this myth is that we just sort of don't understand the difference between average and marginal cost. So like you look at your tax statement, you're like, it costs $15,000 per kid. But that doesn't mean that if we add another kid, it's adding $15,000 to the budget. The marginal cost per kid, assuming there's capacity in the school district, which for most, if not all of New Hampshire, there is, it's actually 0. It doesn't cost you anything to add a kid in the school district if there's capacity there. And then the third part of this is that if you are adding kids, does it cause your property taxes to go up? And of course, the answer to that is no. And then the third part of this myth is that we forget that the housing that's being built is bringing in additional revenue. So say, for example, we look at like multifamily housing, we're building new housing. It's bringing in revenue that supports any kids that do live there going to the school system. And we know from looking at the data that what we're seeing is that housing is positive. It's fiscally positive for our school districts.
You know, what's interesting, for a long time, kids is a 4-letter word in the world. And the crazy thing, I've been looking at enrollment numbers in Dover for 25 years. And there was a time, as you say, where it truly did correlate to more students per house. And I remember probably 2003, we started seeing that single families were not where kids were coming from. And you can see the difference in our impact fee numbers from that time of where they were. And one of the most enlightening and I think positive comments that we received with the planning board when they realized that mixed use development was a positive was because we did a study in the planning department that between 2010 and 2014, I'm just using bare numbers, 1,000 residential units had been created above commercial, some sort of mixed use foundation. There were 3 students that were added because of that.
Yeah.
And you look at the numbers, as you say, Dover has had a trending flat but decline in student enrollment for at least 10 years. And we're actually one of the better school districts in the sense that we're not nosediving. One of the conversations that I've had with residents and with counselors is that the point you made, there's a certain amount of carrying cost that's involved. If you have to have a teacher for a classroom, you might as well fill the classroom. You might as well look to have the most efficiently run space. And that means student enrollment would be good. But that's not the perception.
Yep.
And it's crazy, Ryan. I think you and I talked about this in the past. We import our kids. We are not having kids in this state to the degree that the myth is there that we do. And we actually import, just like we import our economic development labor, we import our kids. My wife and I are a good example. There's 2 of us. We only had 1 child. So we're a deficit to the state. We're making up for my parents, which were 2 and had 3 kids. So it's an interesting concept. And not that we want to dwell too much on the need for children, which that's a different podcast.
Yes.
But to your point, Ryan, where have you witnessed Dover be on this scale of enrollment? And am I right in my assumption about the trends of where the school enrollment has been?
Yeah, I would say so. Definitely what the data showed when we were participating with New Hampshire Housing on this study was that things are staying pretty stable. From a kid standpoint, we've actually lost, I think we were looking at the figures recently, about 10.6% of kids since 2012. And kids aren't, I guess we're not seeing them born here, but we're seeing them move here.
Yep.
And that's just a trend that I think we'll continue to see in the city.
So we've done in this conversation what I always find both exciting and annoying when I listen to a podcast, which is we drove right into the answer, right into the meat, as opposed to talking about how we got here.
Yeah.
So can one of you talk about what is this study? How did it come about? Where did it come from, and who did it?
Great question, Chris.
Like let's pretend we're the AP. Who, what, where, why, or what?
Right. So this is a study that New Hampshire Housing has done for a long time, and it's because this conversation about school enrollment and housing development keeps coming up. So we did this study originally several years ago, and then decided a couple years ago we got to update the data, and we weren't super surprised by any of the results. We worked with a consultant called Urbanomics out of New York, and they have a location in Portsmouth too. They were fantastic to work with, and they really took this and kind of amped it up. And this publication is available on the Hampshire Housing's website on our publications page. You can find it. It's called From Homes to Classrooms. We did something sort of brilliant this time around, which we're going to make a habit of doing more of, which is that we created a 1-page fact sheet to go along with the, 250-page document. Give you something easy you can hand out to your planning board, your select board. You can hand out to folks who are sort of having concerns or questions about this. And what we do is we look at sort of this student per unit and come up with this like housing multiplier, but then we choose case study communities to look at where are sort of student addresses of new construction. So we're looking at this real housing was built. This is the actual number of students that live in it to come up with these case studies. And Dover was one of our case studies. Thank you so much for participating in this study. Dover's a great case study. They were an obvious choice for us.
One of the things that I recall when we looked at the enrollment in 2008. So what we did was in 2000, I think first time I looked at the enrollment data was probably 98 as part of our land use master plan for that year. And then like every 5 years we would check in. And I think for a while we actually had an ongoing look with the school department where they would send us the data and we would analyze it internally. So in 2008, one of the things we found was that, Ryan, I think you mentioned kids are moving into the state. What we found was that those kids were not coming in elementary school. So there was this perception that there was no enrollment gains because K through 4 were pretty static. But then middle school, and it turns out when we did a little diving that it was either people buying their second home or upgrading. And when they upgrade, they couldn't find a home where they were, the community they were in, so they would move. And so we would find that it was really 5 through 8th grade, maybe 9th or 10th. But typically, and I say this as someone who made this conscious decision myself, you don't want to move school districts in high school. You try to, for your kid's sake, or at least I did, to make that switch between elementary and middle or middle and high school. Do you see those trends continuing? Is that something that we're seeing that the enrollment is spiking or at least growing, whether it's in Dover or statewide at that point?
So something that I think is tricky and was really revealing when we were doing this study was how much nuance there is to this. So we were talking about if enrollment is declining a bit in Dover and you have capacity, say at the high school level, for example. I mentioned I grew up in Nottingham. At the time, there was no bus to get to Co-Brown, so I had to get myself to school every day, whereas my brother took a bus to get to Dover, which was great. Now, Nottingham's invested in a bus because they want more kids to go to Co-Brown and fewer kids to go to Dover. And similarly, I went to high school with kids from Barrington, and at the time, Barrington also had the choice between Co-Brown and Dover. But now Barrington kids are also going to Oyster River. Because there are so many regional school districts, we have this flexibility that we really didn't have. And even I was talking to a city councilor in Portsmouth, and Dover is similar, where you have more than one elementary school, where if one school is at capacity but another school isn't, that means that you can move some kids around. And I know I made that sound much simpler than it actually is. Redistricting is really hard, but we have this flexibility to sort of move kids around to make the capacity that we have work for us.
My experience is that redistricting students is more intolerable than ward redistricting for voting areas. That people are more tied to their neighborhood school than they are to who their counselor is.
Totally get that. And now, when my husband and I decided to buy a house in 2020, we were sort of torn because we wanted to end up in Dover. The housing market is really challenging. Anybody who's bought a home in the past several years is yep, I totally get it. We ended up in Newmarket. And so in Newmarket, it's just Newmarket kids, and they're kindergarten all the way through senior year of high school. So it's a totally different environment than this regional kind of moving kids around thing. It's interesting.
A lot easier to track, though.
A lot easier to track.
The study, does it focus purely on public schools, or is there private schools data available, and how is that accounted for?
Yeah, there is some conversation in the study about not just private school, but also rates of homeschooling. And we even talked a little bit about the impact of special education, because that's all kind of complicated asterisk when we're talking about school funding. And I'll say that, again, this is one of those misunderstandings that I actually completely understand, because it's confusing, and property taxes are confusing in New Hampshire. And I went to a really great presentation at the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute's conference back in December. And there was a presentation on local school funding, and New Hampshire, in comparison to the entire rest of the country, over relies on our property taxes to pay for local schools, local education. And so I understand people's sort of resistance or concern about I really don't want my property taxes to go up. They're already high. And then there's also the flip side where but we also need kids, and we need them to have a good education, whether it's in our public schools or if they choose to homeschool or go to a private school, figure out a way to pay for that and make it good.
So Ryan, when you first, in your capacity at the time, you were representing Dover, providing the information. Now, in your greater role, you are taking this data and helping to educate along with Sarah and others. How do you present the data? What are some of the summary points or the education opportunities that this data has provided?
Yeah, I think what really jumped out for me, both participating with New Hampshire Housing at the time and kind of digesting this information now, is just the way that things have been developed in the past has an influence on the number of kids that show up in places. So I think one of the big takeaways I had was single-family homes generate about 0.44 students per new unit, whereas multifamilies are producing far about a quarter of that. So as you think about the way that Dover's developed and the way that we're growing, when you look at the multifamily, the better use of property, that kind of net value per acre, Dover really has been leading the way in generating tax revenue just because of the way that we're concentrating people, and the style of housing has typically produced fewer children. So it's a fun takeaway.
Yeah, I'm curious, it should be now, but let's say 5 years from now, people will look back and will we have actually moved off the dime of saying enrollment's going to be horrible? These new units in my neighborhood, will the NIMBYs track to another reason not to want those units in? Because student enrollment really shouldn't be that driving conversation at this point. We're seeing such a flat, and I think flat is a positive term in this regard, because we're not declining to the degree that we could be. It's curious, the role and connection, Sarah, you alluded to it at the beginning. It's age old that students are housing equals students. Ryan, You've mentioned the single family, you've mentioned a multi. What other categories of housing are in the actual report?
So we had looked at multifamily, we looked at single family, condos, manufactured homes. So kind of across the gamut of the types of housing that every community's.
When you say condos, do you mean townhouses, i.e. attached single family, or
Yes.
do you mean, because it's a form of ownership as well?
It is a form of ownership. Yeah, this would be more, purpose-built for sale as opposed to purpose-built for rent.
Yeah, that was a whole conversation we had during the production of the publication, because I didn't like the term condos in there. I live in a single family attached townhouse in a row of 4. I'm like, is that a condo? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's tricky, especially here in Dover, because although the state allows the planning board to approve condominium as a form of subdivision, Dover does not recognize it that way. We recognize it as a form of ownership, not a form of land use.
Right.
So
Right. It's not a housing
another
type.
way we're cool.
Yeah. I think both condos, the way it's used in the report, and manufactured housing was really interesting in that, like, no kids live in those housing types. Like, manufactured housing specifically is like 1 school-age kid per every 100 units. 100 units of manufactured housing. There's really, like, no kids in that housing type.
Yeah, I think that is one of those sectors that has evolved to be a 55 older panacea.
Yep.
And not that 55 and older can't have kids in the schools. I mean, we're having children later if we're having them. So that is fully an opportunity.
Right.
What other takeaways should the listener be aware of, or should we be thinking about? And I phrase it that way because my hope is that we actually generate conversation about this, as opposed to someone listening to this, clicking it off and saying, well, that was a good 20 minutes of my time.
I think you alluded to it, Chris, but there's always going to be an argument against new housing in and around a neighborhood. And while we can try to address this particular one from the student enrollment standpoint, you just have to understand that there'll be another one that comes up at some point. I think the biggest takeaway that I have from reports like this and from other work that we've done when the subject of property taxes increases and trying to put that onus on new residents, at the end of the day, it's a math equation. And the wider your tax base is, the more you can spread out whatever expenses the municipality is going to have and the less individual tax burden there's going to be. So I think just regardless of what this report says, regardless of what people are saying when it comes to property taxes and the way we do things in New Hampshire, just understanding that that's simple math and that the more people, the more building, the wider we can spread that base out, the less expensive it's going to be to live here.
Yep. And this is one of the few narratives where we have really, 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 really good data. And so my hope is not just that we stop using school children as a reason not to build housing, but that we maybe do the opposite and the narrative shifts and, like, we need housing. Like you, Chris, my husband and I only had 1 kid. Like, we're not doing a good job meeting that replacement rate here in New Hampshire. This table is not a great example of people. Yeah. This table is not a good example of people who are, like, helping to contribute. My mom is one of 8, so I feel okay about that decision, but
Right. The law of averages helps you.
yes, yeah, it does. It really does. But my hope is that, and I know, and maybe Ryan remembers too, our generation was gigantic. And so there actually was a time when we had, like, temporary classrooms set up in the parking lot. And, like, there really was a time when our schools were sort of busting at the seams. Like, we were at capacity and exceeding capacity. And of course, there are people who remember this might be thinking that's what they're picturing in their head. But that's not actually the reality in 2024. So since we have this great data, let's talk not about how to prevent new housing from happening because of school kids and because of the impact on our property taxes. Let's talk about how do we get more kids here because we actually really need them. They're our future.
You know, it's an interesting point about the population figures, because I remember sitting, must have been 2017, at National APA Conference in New York, and I was sitting next to Donna Benton, our planning director. And the speaker had a graph up that showed the boomers up high, my generation down low, and then her generation, the millennials, back up higher than the boomers. And she looked at me and she was like, haha. And I don't know where the Gen Z, where that population fits in there. I'm going to guess it's closer to millennials than it is to Gen X. But I suspect that we will soon be called the forgotten generation.
Well, and I'm curious too, because now it's like millennials' turn to have kids. Yeah. Gen Alpha, my son, like, what is his population going to look like? I can't imagine it's going to be high. I have just as many friends either having 1 kid or 0 kids, and then only a handful of people I know who are like, I'm having 3. Good for them.
So as we wrap up, we've talked about the report. We've talked about the takeaways from the report. What's next? Do you schedule a follow-up report in a couple of years? Do you continue to roll this out and educate? What's the lifespan of the report?
Yeah, it's a good question. It does make sense at some point to continue to update this data as population demographic data changes. I don't know when that'll be. Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? But I think it's important for us to do this sort of education and roll this out and make sure that people just understand the core concepts, because it's pretty easy to look at the population and see nothing massive has changed since we did this report. And this report actually doesn't differ that much in the conclusions and the takeaways, if at all, from the report that we did 10 years ago, 13 years ago now. And so the data itself may get stale, but the messages doesn't. And so it's really up to us. And again, something like doing this 1-pager in this fact sheet, going to communities and presenting about this information, encouraging them to sort of look at the data themselves and apply it to their own community. It's just an important piece for us to keep on plugging on. And we could use people's help at the sort of the local level doing exactly that.
How does someone find this report?
So it's on New Hampshire Housing's website, nhhousing.org, under our publications and reports tab. You can find it there. The 1-pager is also there. Or, of course, you can email me, info@nhhousing.org. It'll find its way to me, I promise.
Alrighty. Any other things that the listener should know? Any other resources that you want to make sure that they're aware of or talk about?
I'd encourage anyone to just check out New Hampshire Housing's publications page. There are, in addition to this report, many, many others that address common myths and misperceptions, but also just have good information as far as the cost of things, the way things are trending, demographics, and all kinds of good info.
I think I said it when Rob Dappas was on the podcast, that people underestimate the resource that New Hampshire Housing Finance is, that you have so much knowledge base, so much opportunity to share that knowledge, and you're willing and ready to get involved and come out on a nice morning in winter of 2025 and speak to me and a listener. That is something I think that people don't realize, how accessible New Hampshire Housing is. So thank you both for being here today and for taking part.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
It was great to be here.
Dover has a wealth of history in its over 400 years of existence. Coming up, Mike Gillis is going to share some of that history with us.
This month, in March 1976, the presses at Foster's Daily Democrat rolled with somber purpose. The newspaper broke its own tradition, positioning a story where few appeared, above the masthead itself. This rare editorial decision, reserved for events of extraordinary significance, marked the passing of a man whose generosity had benefited the entire city. S. Judson Dunaway, the mothball magnate turned philanthropist extraordinaire, had died at 85, leaving behind a legacy woven into the very fabric of Dover's schools, hospitals, and public spaces. Dunaway, who died on March 3, 1976, arrived in Dover in 1928 when he left New York to become co-founder of the Expello Corporation. Born in Standardsville, Virginia, on June 11, 1890, Dunaway came from humble beginnings. He worked as a boy on a farm at his father's country store, receiving just 6 years of education at a one-room country school where he later became a janitor. His path to success wasn't without challenges. After completing a correspondence course in advertising and working in Philadelphia and New York, Dunaway became fascinated with business rather than practicing law, despite attending New York Law School at night. After 3 business failures, he established the Expello Corporation in Dover, acquiring control of the company in 1934 and changing its name to the Judson Dunaway Corporation. The company produced numerous household products, including mothballs and the well-known Vanish toilet bowl cleaner, growing to national prominence. In 1958, it merged with Dracut Products of Cincinnati, at which point Dunaway retired. Dunaway's impact on Dover began when he established his business, but expanded significantly when he created the S. Judson Dunaway Foundation. When forming the foundation, he told its trustees, quote, I well realize that I can't take this money with me. You are charged, therefore, with the responsibility of channeling these funds into charitable areas where it will do most good for the most people. His philanthropy in Dover was extraordinary. He contributed over $1.5 million to Wentworth Douglas Hospital, including funding for the Dunaway Pavilion, adding 48 patient beds, new medical facilities, and major expansions to the hospital's pre-existing departments. Dover residents benefited from his contributions to recreational facilities, most notably the S. Judson Dunaway Fields. In 1968, Dunaway donated $134,000 for the development of a football stadium, baseball fields, and other athletic facilities at Dover High School. At the dedication ceremony, Dunaway expressed his philosophy of giving, stating, quote, "I'm the one that gets the benefit out of giving." Dover Mayor Louis Stocklin expressed his gratitude to Dunaway at the dedication ceremony, saying, quote, "These fields will be an everlasting tribute to you." The S. Judson Dunaway Foundation also provided $280,000 for Dover's indoor swimming pool, which served both as a competitive swimming venue and for public recreation. A plaque at the football field honored him as, quote, "industrialist, sportsman, humanitarian, philanthropist." Dunaway also played a significant role in Dover's governance, serving as a member of the city council and contributing to the city's transition to the manager-council form of government, which Dover still uses today. By the time of his death, Dunaway had given more than $2 million to the city of Dover alone, while also supporting causes throughout New Hampshire, Maine, and his native Virginia. When asked about his philosophy of giving, Dunaway replied with what became his well-known motto, quote, "What you spend, you have. What you save, you may lose. What you give away comes back to you." Dunaway's vision and philanthropy left an indelible mark on Dover that continues to benefit its residents nearly 5 decades after his passing.
Thanks for listening to the Dover Download this week. If you like what you heard, subscribe through your favorite podcast aggregator. And if you have something you want to hear a topic on, let us know. Finally, this is just one of the many ways we share information about the city of Dover. You can subscribe to the Dover Downloads email newsletter every week or other newsletters that we have by going to the City of Dover homepage, www.dover.nh.gov. Have a great week.